All right, fifth graders, it is time for Unit 2, Lesson 10. So you need your Unit 2 math packet, a pencil, and you should have your packet open up to page 14, and it should say Lesson 10 at the top. And we're going to talk about rounding today. We're going to round just whole numbers today, and this should be a review. And I know last year was a different kind of year, so I thought we'll review some skills from before. And then tomorrow we'll talk about rounding decimal values. So today it's a review topic, and if it's not review for you, if this is something new, it's okay. That's what this is all about. Okay, so to start off, I ask you to round to the nearest 10. And I want you to think about what rounding means. Basically, you're just asking which 10 it's closest to. Okay, so if I went to the store and I was gonna buy, I don't know, some Smarties for your test. If the Smarties cost, let's say $2.79, and somebody asked, oh, how much were those? I'd say they were about $3. So when you round, you're telling me about what it's closest to, okay? That's just the whole idea of what we're doing here. So when I ask you to round to the nearest 10, you're gonna wanna identify what number's in the tens place. In this case, this 7 is in the tens place. So when I ask you to round to the nearest 10, I'm asking you which 10 72 is closest to. And your first step is to figure out, well, what are my options? Which two tens is 72 in between? It's always gonna be in between to start, the number that's in the tens place, and this 7 represents 70. I'm gonna put this on a number line because I feel like a visual model for this really helps rather than just memorizing a rule. Now, up from the next, so we have 70, what's the next 10 that 72 is between? So the next 10 up from 70 would be 80. So I'm gonna put 80 right here, and you should be doing this too. Everything that I write down, I want you to write down. I promise you this visual model is very, very helpful. When you just memorize rules, you only know those for a short time. But when you have a visual model and you understand the process, then you learn it and know it forever. Okay, so basically what's gonna really help us to identify which one it's closer to is to figure out the middle. So what's halfway between 70 and 80? Yeah, you guessed it, 75. Okay, so basically when you're trying to figure out which 10 72 is closest to, if it is less than halfway over to the middle, if it's less than halfway from 70, it will be closer to 70. If it's halfway or more, we would consider that closest to 80. So here's my halfway mark. 72 would come before 75. That means it's gonna be in this area, and if a number falls in this area, that means it's closest to the one we start with. So 72 will be closer to 70. It would round to 70. We're gonna do the same process for this next one. And yes, I like to give you weird examples. Right here, I have 8 ones, but I don't have any 10s. So I told you the very first thing you're supposed to do is list whatever 10 is in the tens place, and right now there's nothing. What number represents nothing? 0. So the first number on my number line is actually gonna be 0, and if I'm rounding to the nearest 10, what's the next 10 up from 0? 10. Now we're gonna put our halfway mark on there, and halfway between 0 and 10 would be 5. So I have 8 right here, right? Wouldn't 8 be between this 5 and 10? So that means it's more than halfway. That means that 8 would round to 10. That's the closest to 10 that 8 is to. And if you think about it, 8 is 8 away from 0, and it's only 2 away from 10. Yeah, it's closer to that. Okay, for letter C, I'm not asking you to round to the nearest 100. I'm asking you to round to the nearest 10. This 5 is in the tens place. So my starting amount here, the 10 that it could be closer to, it can be 150. So this number in the tens place stays the same. The number after that 10 is a 0 because I'm rounding. Now the next 10 up from 150, add 10 to 150, that would be 160. So 154 is either closer to 150 or 160. The halfway mark between 150 and 160 is 155. 154 would come before 155. That means it stays to the 150. So again, my two options, it's either 150 or 160. If it falls in this range, we keep it at 150. If it's halfway or more, then it will bump up to the next 10. We're going to use the same exact process when we round to the nearest 100. Okay, so this time I'm looking at the number in the hundreds place. In this case, the 4 is in the hundreds place. So the first 100 that 473 is between would be 400. I keep that the same. The next 100 up from 400, so if I add 100 to 400, would be 500. Halfway between 400 and 500 is 450. So again, if I'm trying to round 473 to the nearest 100, it's either going to be 400 or 500. And to figure out which one it's closest to, figure out where it falls. 473 would fall past the halfway mark. That means it would be closer to 500. For letter E, I don't see a number in the hundreds place, right? We don't see that. We know that it's really 0, so we would start with 0. 100 up from 0 is 100. The halfway mark is 50. 51 is just past the halfway mark. That means it's going to be closer to 100 than it is to 0. So 51 would round to 100 if I was rounding to the nearest hundreds. It would be different if I was rounding to the nearest 10, but I'm not. I'm rounding to the nearest 100. Look at letter F. This 8 is in the hundreds place, okay? So it's either going to be 1,800 or the next 100 up from 1,800 is 1,900. Notice, my thousands place stayed the same. We're not rounding to the nearest 1,000 right now, we're rounding to the nearest 100. Halfway between 1,800 and 1,900 is 1,850, right? Isn't the 50 that halfway mark between those hundreds? So when I see 1,841, I know that's going to come before the halfway mark. That means it's going to be closer to 1,800. All right, our last little piece today, we are going to round to the nearest 1,000. Now we're looking at the number in the thousands place. Again, it's the same exact process. I'm going to identify what number's in the thousands place, and that's my starting 1,000. So I'm trying to figure out, is 6,398 closer to 6,000 or the next 1,000 up, which would be 7,000. It's easy to see if we identify the halfway mark. So halfway between 6,000 and 7,000 would be 6,500. Okay, so 6,398 would come before the halfway mark. That means that 6,398 would be in this little section here, which is closer to 6,000 than 7,000. So 6,398 rounded to the nearest 1,000 is 6,000. Basically, you should have a digit in the thousands place followed by a bunch of zeros. Okay, 299, you might be thinking, oh, 300. But I didn't ask you to round to the nearest 100. I asked you to round to the nearest 1,000. And when I look at this, there isn't a number in the thousands place. That means my starting amount should be 0. When I go up 1,000 from 0 to the next 1,000, it would just be exactly 1,000. And my halfway mark between 0 and 1,000 is 500. Now I have to ask myself, where would 299 fall? Is it going to be closer to 0 or is it going to be closer to 1,000? Well, 299 would happen right about here. That would mean that 299 is closer to 0 than 1,000. So I know it seems weird, but 299 rounded to the nearest 1,000 would be 0. Okay, for letter I, this 7 is in the thousands place. So I'm trying to figure out, is 67,500 closer to 67,000, or the next 1,000 up from that would be 68,000. Halfway between 67,000 and 68,000 would be 67,500. Now this falls exactly halfway. And these were like those problems we had talked about before where if it lands on the top of the hill, you just blow it on over. If it's exactly halfway, we always bump it up to that next 1,000. So this would be closer to 68,000. That would be the answer there. So basically you identify the place that you want to round to and you figure out, okay, which 2 is it between? Identify your halfway mark, and if it's less than halfway, you keep it to the lower. And if it is halfway or more, you would bump it up to the higher. It's basically just figuring out which one it's closer to. That's what rounding is. All right, you're gonna do your lesson 10 practice next, so you'll need your whiteboard, your marker, and eraser.